The door to my own workshop slammed so hard the windows rattled. I stood there with sawdust on my hands and grease under my fingernails, 63 years old, staring at the back of my son-in-law's jacket as he walked across my driveway like he owned it, which, I suppose, he believed he did. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 41 years building a furniture workshop from nothing. A small operation outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. 3 employees at the peak. Custom pieces that went into homes across the state. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Every splinter in my hands, every crack in the concrete floor, every drill bit worn down to nothing, mine. My wife passed 7 years ago. Lung cancer, fast and merciless. After that, it was just me and my daughter. And then my daughter got married, and then it was me, my daughter, my son-in-law, and a cold draft that never quite left the house. His name was Brendan. My daughter had met him at a company retreat. He was in sales, which should have told me everything I needed to know. He had the kind of smile that arrived before he did and left after he did, and the kind of handshake that was slightly too firm, the handshake of a man who has read about handshakes in a book. My daughter was 31 when they married. She was radiant. She was also, I would come to understand, tired of being alone, and Brendan understood exactly how to walk through that particular door. The first year was fine. The second year, Brendan started coming to the workshop. At first, I thought he was curious. He'd stand in the doorway with a coffee cup, watching me work, asking questions. What kind of wood is that? How long does a commission like this take? What's the margin on a dining set? I answered everything. He was my daughter's husband. I wanted us to get along, but the questions changed. Slowly, the way a room changes temperature without you noticing until you're already cold. How much did I owe on the property? Had I considered bringing in investors? Did I know that the land alone, given the rezoning happening 2 counties over, was worth considerably more than the business sitting on it? Had I ever thought about retirement? I was 62. I hadn't thought about retirement because I didn't want to retire. The workshop was not just income. It was the thing I got up for in the morning. It was where I still felt my wife sometimes, in the smell of cedar and linseed oil, in the particular slant of afternoon light through the south window. Brendan did not understand this, or he understood it perfectly and simply didn't care. My daughter came to me one Sunday afternoon while I was sanding a rocking chair. She sat on the old stool near the workbench, the one she used to sit on as a little girl while I worked, and she said, without quite meeting my eyes, that Brendan had been talking to some people, business people, that there might be an opportunity to sell the property and use the capital to invest in something larger, something with more upside, something that could set the whole family up for the long term. I kept sanding. I asked her what she thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought it might be worth hearing him out. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. Every morning I came to the workshop, opened the doors, smelled the wood, ran my hands over whatever piece I was working on, and I thought about it. And every morning I came to the same answer, no. When I told Brendan, he nodded. He said he understood. He said we'd revisit it. That was when things began to change in the house. My daughter and son-in-law had moved in with me 18 months after the wedding. The plan was temporary. They were saving for a house. Brendan had a gap between jobs. It made sense. 18 months became 2 years. 2 years became 3. The temporary became permanent in the way that temporary things do when nobody names what's happening. Brendan started bringing people to the property without asking me. I'd come out in the morning and find a man in a sport coat walking the fence line, taking photos on his phone. I'd ask who he was. Brendan would come out and say he was just a friend, just looking around, nothing serious. The refrigerator ran low and nobody replaced what they used. My tools were moved and not put back, small things. The kind of things that could each be explained away individually, but that, together, were a message. One evening, I was watching the news in the living room when Brendan came in, sat down across from me, and told me he had spoken to an attorney, that given my age and given that I was living alone before they moved in, there were options for transferring the deed to the property into a joint family trust, that it would protect everyone, that it was just smart estate planning. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "Whose attorney?" He said that wasn't really the point. I said it was very much the point. He said I was being stubborn. He said I was living in the past. He said my wife would have wanted me to be practical. That was a mistake. Not because it made me angry, though it did, the kind of deep, quiet angry that doesn't raise its voice. It was a mistake because it told me exactly who I was dealing with. A man who would reach for a dead woman's name to move a piece of property was a man with no floor beneath his ethics. There was nothing he would not do. I needed to understand that clearly, and now I did. I told him good night. He left the room. I sat there in the dark for a while after the television went off. I thought about my daughter. I thought about what she was choosing, or what she had already chosen, or whether she had any real choice at all by that point. I didn't know. I still don't fully know. That is the part I have carried the heaviest. The following week, my daughter told me she agreed with Brendan, that the property transfer made sense, that she was asking me to consider it for the sake of the family. I asked her if she had read the documents. She said she trusted Brendan to handle the details. I went to bed that night and I lay in the dark and I listened to the house. I had built the back porch with my own hands 22 years ago. I had put in the flagstone walkway the summer my daughter turned 10, and she had pressed her handprint into the wet mortar at the end of the path, and I had left it there, and it was still there. I knew every settling creak in this house. I knew where the draft came in under the back door and exactly which windowsill the morning light hit first in winter. I was not giving it to a man who had been in my family for 4 years and smiled the way salespeople smile. The next morning, I drove to Knoxville and sat down with my own attorney, a woman named Hargrove who had done our family's estate work since before my wife's passing. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is what good attorneys do. When I finished, she asked me one question. Did I have any documentation? I told her I had been keeping notes, dates, conversations, the names of the men Brendan had brought to walk the property. I had written them down in a yellow legal pad I kept in the drawer of my bedside table, the one place in the house I knew Brendan would not go, because it also contained my wife's reading glasses and a photograph of her from 1987 and some things a man like Brendan would find no value in. Hargrove told me that was a start. She told me what else I would need. I listened carefully. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the hills, watching the lights change over the ridge. I had never been a man who moved fast. I built furniture. Furniture requires patience. You cannot rush a joint or it will fail. You cannot rush the drawing or it will crack. You do the steps in the right order, and you wait as long as the material requires. And then, when it is ready, you have something that lasts. I had time. I had been building for 41 years. Over the next 2 months, I did several things quietly. I had the property appraised by a licensed appraiser I found through a referral, not to anyone Brendan knew. The number was significant. I had always known the land had value, but seeing it written down on official letterhead had a clarifying effect. I contacted the 2 men I knew in the county who handled commercial real estate, not to sell, to understand. I wanted to know what Brendan thought he was building, and I learned it. There was a development group working the corridor, buying parcels for a mixed-use project. The land adjacent to mine had already been optioned. Brendan had been in conversations with the developer's representative for at least 6 months. He had positioned himself as someone who could deliver my parcel. He had told them my daughter was the primary decision maker. My daughter did not know this. I spent a long afternoon in Ms. Hargrove's office after I learned this. I asked her what my options were. She laid them out. She was thorough. and she was honest, which meant she also told me which paths would be painful and which would simply be long. We talked about my daughter. I told Miss Hargrove that I did not want to destroy my daughter's marriage. I wanted to protect my daughter from a man who was using her as a signature on a real estate transaction. There is a difference. Miss Hargrove understood the difference. The plan that came together was not dramatic. It was paperwork. It was phone calls. It was a revised estate structure that was entirely legal, entirely proper, and entirely not what Brendan expected. It was the kind of thing that doesn't look like anything until the moment it becomes everything. I also called my nephew, who is a retired sheriff's deputy and who has a face that communicates a complete lack of patience for dishonesty. I told him I might need him to be present at a family meeting. He said, "Name the time." The occasion I chose was Thanksgiving. My daughter had suggested we have the holiday at the house. She had been almost warm to me in recent weeks, and I wondered whether she was feeling the pressure of what Brendan was building, or whether she was simply relieved that I seemed to have gone quiet. Either way, she planned a full dinner. She invited her mother's sister and her husband, driving up from Chattanooga. She invited a neighbor couple we had known for 15 years. What she did not know was that I had also called Miss Hargrove, who would arrive at 6 o'clock. What she did not know was that the development representative, a man named Cordell, who had already spoken with me twice, had agreed to be present as well. What Brendan did not know was that Cordell had come to me first 6 weeks ago, that when Cordell realized the land he'd been promised access to was controlled entirely by the man whose name was on the deed, and not by the woman whose name was in Brendan's pitch deck, he had recalculated. Cordell was a businessman. He wanted the parcel. He wanted it through a clean transaction with the actual owner, not through a proxy arrangement built on a misrepresentation. He had agreed to be at that table because it served his interests, and sometimes that is enough. Thanksgiving morning, I was in the kitchen before anyone else woke up. I am not a particularly gifted cook, but I know my way around a turkey and a cast iron skillet, and there is something steadying about the ritual of it. The pulling of the bird out of the brine, the preparation of the roasting pan, the smell of sage and butter filling the kitchen at 6 in the morning while the house is still dark. I had done this every year since my wife stopped being able to do it herself, and I had done it every year since she left, and I did it this year the same as always. My daughter came downstairs around 8 and stood in the kitchen doorway with a surprised look, like she had forgotten I was capable of this. She said, "Dad, you didn't have to." I said I wanted to. She came and stood next to me at the counter, and for a little while we worked in the kitchen together the way we had when she was young, her chopping the celery while I stirred the gravy, and I let myself be in that moment without thinking about the evening. Brendan came down at 9:30, poured coffee, asked me what time dinner was. 6 o'clock, I told him. We'll have some guests. He didn't ask who. He nodded and took his coffee upstairs. My wife's sister and her husband arrived at 2. The neighbor couple at 4. Everyone was cheerful in the way that people are cheerful at Thanksgiving when they are determined not to examine anything too closely, which I have always found to be both the great strength and the great fragility of the holiday. At 10 minutes to 6, Brendan was in the living room with my wife's brother-in-law talking about football when I heard a car in the driveway, then another. I went to the front door. Miss Hargrove, in a wool coat, carrying a briefcase, Cordell, whom I had met but nobody else at that table had, in a sport coat and a patient expression, and my nephew, who had parked on the street and came up the walkway behind him. Brendan appeared in the hallway. I watched his face go through several things in rapid sequence. Recognition. He knew Cordell, though Cordell was meant to be his contact, not mine. Calculation. What was Cordell doing here? Then a particular kind of stillness. The stillness of a man who realizes the room has changed shape while he was standing in it. I introduced everyone at the dinner table. I did it calmly, the way I would introduce guests at any holiday meal. Ms. Hargrove, my attorney. Cordell, a gentleman interested in the property, who I believed everyone might already know by name, if not by face. My nephew, who smiled pleasantly and said nothing. My daughter looked at me with an expression I cannot fully describe. It was not anger, not yet. It was something before anger. A kind of suspended disbelief, a held breath. After the blessing, which I asked my wife's sister to say, because she says it better than anyone, I spoke. I told the table that I had spent the past 2 months learning some things about my property, my family's financial situation, and some conversations that had taken place in my name without my knowledge. I said this without drama, the way I would describe a problem with a piece of wood. Here is what I found. Here is what it means. Here is what I intend to do about it. I told my daughter that a development group had been in negotiations to acquire my land, that the representative of that group, sitting at our table, had been told that my daughter had authority over the transaction, that she did not, that I did, that I had always done. I told her that Brendan had been positioned in these negotiations as the facilitator, that there was a finder's arrangement, a percentage, not insignificant, that he stood to receive upon sale. I put the documents on the table. My daughter looked at them. Then she looked at Brendan. Brendan said I was mischaracterizing the situation. I said the documents were right there and invited him to point to the mischaracterization. He did not point to anything. Cordell said gently that the description I had given was accurate to his understanding of the arrangement, and that he wanted to be clear he had had no intention of participating in a transaction that misrepresented the ownership structure, which was why, when the actual owner had reached out, he had been willing to meet. Brendan said Cordell was taking my side. Cordell said he was taking no one's side. He was a businessman. My daughter had not moved. She was looking at the papers, and she was very still, and I knew that stillness. I had seen it when she was 8, and found out a girl at school had been telling lies about her. That particular contained stillness of a person integrating something that does not fit the shape they thought the world was. I said, softer now, speaking to her and not to the table, I am not asking anything of you tonight. I am not telling you what to do about your marriage. What I am telling you is that the property will not be sold or transferred, and that I have restructured the estate accordingly with Miss Hargrove's help, and that those documents are already filed. The decision has been made. I paused. I said, I built that workshop for 41 years. Your mother and I built this house together. Your handprint is in the stone at the end of the walkway. I will not sign it to a finder's fee. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then my wife's sister said very quietly, should I serve the rolls? We ate dinner. Cordell stayed for the meal, which I had not expected, but which I was glad of. He turned out to be a decent conversationalist, and he and my neighbor talked about college basketball for most of the second course. My nephew ate 2 full plates and complimented the turkey, which I accepted because I had brined it for 2 days and it deserved the compliment. Ms. Hargrove had sweet potato pie and told me it was the best she'd had in years, which may or may not have been true, but which I appreciated nonetheless. Brendan ate very little. He left the table before dessert. My daughter stayed. She did not speak to me directly until after the guests had gone and the dishes were mostly done. She came and stood in the kitchen doorway, much as she had that morning, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen since she was a teenager. The look of someone reassembling their understanding of something they thought they already understood. She said, how long have you known? I said, long enough to be sure. She said, why didn't you tell me? I said, because I wanted you to see it, not hear it from me. She was quiet. Then she said very low, I didn't know about the finder's fee. I told her I believed her. She leaned against the door frame and looked at the kitchen floor for a while. She said she needed time to think. I said that was reasonable. I did not press. I did not ask what she was going to do, or what the marriage was going to look like, or whether Brendan would still be sleeping upstairs by the new year. Those were her questions to answer. She did come to me, a few weeks later, not to the house but to the workshop, in the morning, like she used to. She sat on the old stool. I was working on a commission, a blanket chest for her family in Oak Ridge, cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails. She watched me for a while without speaking, the way she had as a girl. Finally, she said she had spoken to an attorney, her own attorney. I didn't say anything. I kept working the chisel along the joint. She said she wanted to understand her options. I said that was smart. She said, "Were you scared when you were putting all of this together?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, I wasn't scared. I was lonely. There is a difference. Scared means you don't know what's going to happen. Lonely means you know exactly what's happening and you have to carry it by yourself for a while." I had been lonely, yes, but I had known what I was doing, and I had known why. And on the mornings when I walked out to the workshop before sunup and put my hands on the wood and remembered every reason I had stayed, that had been enough. She looked at the blanket chest taking shape on the workbench. She asked who it was for. I told her. A family in Oak Ridge. 40th anniversary gift from the adult children. They'd sent me a photograph of the parents and a list of things they loved. Hiking, old movies, their granddaughter. I'd incorporated a small detail, barely visible inside the lid. A set of footprints like a trail marker, small enough that you might not notice it unless you were looking. My daughter looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "You always put something in, don't you? Something small that most people don't see." I said, "The people who need to see it, see it." She nodded slowly. The morning light came through the south window the way it always does. The way it did when my wife used to bring me coffee and sit on that same stool and watch me work and not say anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. I went back to the chisel. My daughter stayed a while longer. Outside, the flagstone path ran from the workshop door to the back porch, and at the far end of it, in the stone, the small pressed handprint of a 10-year-old girl had survived 22 winters and was not going anywhere. There's a thing I noticed about wood over 41 years of working with it. When a joint fails, it almost never fails suddenly. It fails because somewhere in the process, someone took a shortcut, rushed the glue, forced the fit, ignored a small gap because it didn't look like much. The collapse, when it comes, looked sudden to anyone watching. But the man who built it usually knows exactly where it started. I think about Brendan that way sometimes. Not with bitterness. Bitterness is a finish that clouds everything underneath. I think about him the way I'd think about a failed piece. Where did the gap first appear, and did I see it and look away? I saw it. I looked away longer than I should have. That's on me. What I've come to understand, sitting in the workshop on mornings after all of it, is that doing right by people is not the same as being soft with them. I was gentle with Brendan for years because I thought gentleness was the same as goodness. It isn't, always. Sometimes the most decent thing you can do for everyone in the room, including the people you love, is to be clear. Clear about what belongs to whom. Clear about what you will and will not accept. Clear about the fact that patience is not the same as permission. My wife used to say that a man who knows what he's worth doesn't need to announce it. She meant it as a compliment. But I think there's a second half to that sentence that she left unspoken, which is, and he doesn't need to pretend he's worth less to make other people comfortable. I pretended for too long. That is the honest truth of it. What pulled me through wasn't anger. Anger is useful for about 20 minutes, and then it starts costing you more than it's worth. What pulled me through was thinking clearly when everything in me wanted to react. It was going to Miss Perlin, Hargrove, instead of confronting Brendan in the driveway. It was keeping notes in a yellow legal pad instead of having the argument at the dinner table 6 months too early. Intelligence, in my experience, is less about being the smartest person in the room and more about knowing when to be quiet and when to move. Brendan was smart in the way that salespeople are smart, quick, persuasive, good at reading the room. But he was not patient, and patience over time beats quick almost every time. The part I'm most grateful for and I don't say this lightly, is that my daughter came back to the workshop. Not immediately, not easily, but she came. She sat on the stool. She watched me work. That took something from her, more than it took from me. To sit in that room and reassemble what she understood about the man she had married, about what had been done in her name. That required a kind of courage I'm not sure I would have had at her age. There's a handprint in the stone at the end of my walkway. She put it there when she was 10 years old. I have walked past it every single day for 22 years, and I have never once considered filling it in. Some things you build to last. The trick is knowing which things those are, and refusing to let anyone convince you they're worth less than they are.